Alright everybody, in this video we're going to go over the shading techniques, exercises, and the shading textures worksheets together. I'm going to give you a few pointers of how to approach shading with the different techniques, as well as how to approach the different textures that you're going to see on this worksheet. Starting off with the shading technique exercises worksheet, you are going to be replicating the different shading techniques that are labeled in each individual box. Your goal is to fill in each box dark to light as progressively as you can. So darkest, and then your middle tones, and then your lightest tone as possible. This upper bar is a good example of what you're aiming for. You're also going to be responsible for shading in the spheres that are on the right side with the same shading technique that you used to fill in the value scale on the left. The first technique note I have for you is that the closer you make your marks on the paper and the more pressure you apply with your hand, the darker your shading is going to be. So obviously, if you press really hard and you make everything really close together, it's going to get super dark. When you're shading, to make your tones lighter, if you're struggling with putting down your marks too dark in the first place and you're struggling to get these midtones inside of the value scale, try holding your pencil further towards the end and using the side of your pencil. Make sure you're keeping your pencil sharp. When you're using the tip of the pencil, you're automatically going to be putting down a darker shadow. But when you pull your hand back on the pencil and you use the side of the lead, you're automatically going to get a lighter tone that you can put down compared to when you're holding it from here and you're applying pressure. One thing to keep in mind when you're shading in this class is to pay attention to the type of pencil that you're using. We should have had a previous discussion about the different types of pencils and then labels that are at the back end of the pencil. When you are drawing in this class, for these next couple of projects, you will have two types of pencils. You will have something that says H and something that says B. Just a reminder that those two pencils, the H has more clay in it, which means that the tip is sharper and it is significantly lighter than a B pencil would be. Now a B pencil has a lot more graphite in it than it does clay, and so a B pencil makes for an excellent shading pencil. So this was the H pencil, and then if I shade right next to it, that is the difference between the two. So the H pencil comes out kind of grayish, and then the B pencil comes out closer to black. Next thing you need to be aware of is that shading requires time and patience to do correctly, which is something a lot of us are still working on, right? If you rush through it and you don't pay attention and you're not looking at what you're drawing, it's obviously not going to turn out right. So getting right into the shading techniques that are on the left-hand side, we've got hatching, which is a series of parallel lines all going in the same direction. We've got cross-hatching, which is two sets of parallel lines going in opposite directions. We've got circulism, which is a series of overlapping circles. We've got stumping and smudging, which is done using one of these paper stumps. And we've got stippling, which is made with tiny dots. I'm going to show you my finished example here. And you're going to be doing your absolute best to replicate this on your own. So for hatching, remember, the closer you make your marks and the more pressure you apply with your hand, the darker it's going to be. So you can see those series of lines get steadily further and further apart, and it gets lighter as you go. So you can see mine. Cross-hatching is the same as hatching, except you have those two lines going in opposite directions, and the same idea applies. The further away you put those lines, the lighter and lighter it's going to appear. Circulism is basically scribbling over itself. You're basically swirling the pencil in circles in order to overlap them, and the more you overlap them, the smoother the shading is going to be. Stumping and smudging is a lot of people's favorite type of shading because it actually really blends things together and smooths things out. So you can actually start by layering in a good amount of graphite, and you don't really have to concern yourself so much about filling it in all the way. And then you can take a paper stump and you can actually swirl it the same way you would with circulism. You want to do tiny circles. You can actually use that to start to blend in the graphite to the paper, and you can see that it is steadily blending it in and making it very, very smooth. Okay, now the tip of my paper stump is still dirty, meaning it still has graphite on it. So I can start to push it over and I can start to get a lighter value. Now this might not be enough to get the next box filled in. So again, you can just take your pencil, apply a small layer of graphite, and then you can use the stump to blend. And then you just keep going and going, trying to be as light as you can. And then I can actually just gently apply graphite across the entire value scale, trying to be as light as I can, and then I can start to blend with the paper stump. And the last shading technique is actually stippling. My biggest tip for you with stippling is that a lot of students will pick their pencil up and do this, where they're going like this. And you would think that that makes it faster, but it doesn't. It actually takes more time to lift the pencil up and then put it back down, rather than hold it by its tip and then get close to the paper and then move your hand up and down as fast as you can. Now, this first box is going to be very time consuming because you have to put down a lot of dots to get it to be dark. But once you do this first box, it gets easier because you start putting them further and further apart as you go that way. If your hand starts to cramp, take a break, uncramp your hand, stretch it out, and then go back to it. When you start to shade the spheres on the right side, it's especially important that you pay attention to the shape that you're shading. One of the biggest mistakes students make when they're shading is they shade against the form. So this is a sphere, right? And you can see in this example up here that the shadow kind of wraps around the bottom of the sphere. So that's what you're going to try and do on yours. A lot of students, when they're rushing and they're not taking their time, they tend to just shade up and down like this. And so that really flattens it, and it's really not what we're looking for. We want it to be smooth, we want it to be realistic. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna follow the curvature of the sphere to make it look as realistic as possible. And so what that means is that to make your life easier, a lot of students, you're shading like this, right? And so you want to get that nice curvature of the sphere, but you're having a hard time getting it because your wrist doesn't go in that angle and it makes it difficult. So please rotate the paper and then use the side of your pencil to get it in accurately, and then rotate the paper. Don't be afraid to rotate the paper. A lot of students will just plant their hands and they'll try to get it and they'll try to make their wrist do things that it can't do. So try the rotation of the paper, and that will help you follow and wrap around the curvature. And that is it for the shading techniques exercises worksheet. You're going to be replicating each shading technique in the value scales on the left from dark to light, and on the right side you're going to be copying these spheres but using the shading techniques that you practiced on the left side. Alright, once you've finished the shading technique exercises worksheet, you're going to turn that in and you're going to come up and go right to the next worksheet, which is going to be shading textures. So your goal is going to be to replicate the image on the left as best you can in the sphere on the right. All of the shading techniques that you learned when you were practicing the shading technique exercises, you can use multiple ones. You don't have to use just the same one. So you can combine them. For instance, this fur right here, you could probably use hatching really, really well to get that directional fur, and then you can use the paper stump to blend out those shadows so it's not so harsh and it works better. All of these different textures are going to test your ability to use some of these different techniques. My biggest tip for you is to use the eraser. The eraser is your friend. So for this one, for instance, I would actually shade this like a normal sphere, and then I would use a sharp pencil tip eraser or maybe one of these larger erasers to actually carve out the cracks inside of that sphere. And it's the same thing for all of these different ones. I used an eraser to re-carve out highlights after I'd kind of toned the paper. It's very important that you follow the curvature of the sphere. So for instance, for this sphere, you can see that the bricks kind of wrap around the sphere, so you need to pay attention to that. You need to notice that the lines aren't perfectly straight like they would be on a wall. They wrap around, so they're more of an arc than they are straight up and down. And it's the same thing with these scales. They do get bigger in the middle and they get smaller on the edges. So this is really something that you're going to have to pay attention to detail with and to take your time. So remember to take your time, follow the direction of the sphere, do your best, use the paper stump to your advantage, and pay attention to the pencils that you're using. Once you're done, turn it in, and you're good.